missing and murdered Indigenous relatives. I'm Mitch Arvidsson, and along with Eileen Grossman, we are the staff liaisons for the MLC Midwest Canada Relations Committee, which is hosting today's webinar. We are also joined by our colleague Laura Tamaka, who will be helping run today's event. We would like to start today's session with an Indigenous land acknowledgement, and one of our presenters for today, Diane Redsky, will do the honors. Diane?
Thank you, Mitch. So today we honor our Indigenous sisters from across our nations and celebrate our diverse, vibrant cultures, languages, ceremonies, and shared values and natural laws throughout our traditional territories. We acknowledge the lands, the water, the air, and the sacred fires from all of our traditional territories today and always. We honor and recognize our matriarchs and ancestors who have protected and cared for our communities, our traditional teachings, and our responsibility to creation that made it possible for all of us to be here today to reclaim our power and place. Miigwech.
Thank you very much, Diane. We recognize that the subject of today's webinar is traumatic and can be very distressing. If today's discussion becomes too much at any time, please refer to these crisis support lines for help. Several of these phone lines have been suggested by today's presenters. In Canada, there is a national toll-free 24/7 crisis call line providing mental health support for anyone who requires emotional assistance related to missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. You can find this slide and all other slides posted in the chat. Before we get started, I wanted to review a couple of housekeeping notes. Today's webinar is being recorded, and a copy of that recording will be made available on the CSG Midwest website. Please mute your audio during the presentations to help reduce background noise. And finally, after all presentations are finished, we'll open up for questions, comments, and discussion. Please submit your questions in the chat throughout the webinar or raise your hand during the Q&A session, and our staff will call on you to speak. At this time, I'll turn things over to Ohio Speaker Robert Cupp, co-chair of the MLC Midwest Canada Relations Committee, to open today's webinar and introduce the host. Speaker Cupp.
Good morning, everyone. Very pleased that you could join in this webinar today. In addition to serving as Speaker of the Ohio House of Representatives, I represent Ohio's 4th House District, which consists of the city of Lima and the surrounding Allen County. And I have to tell you, there is a great deal of excitement and anticipation here in Ohio this weekend as the Cincinnati Bengals NFL team plays in the Super Bowl for the first time in 30 years. And of course, everyone here is fervently hoping for a Cincinnati win on Sunday. In the Midwestern Legislative Conference, I'm pleased to serve as co-chair of the Midwest Canada Relations Committee, along with Minister Kelvin Gertzen of Manitoba. And I also want to recognize our co-vice chairs, MPP Percy Hatfield of Ontario and Senator Jim Stamas of Michigan. The MLC Midwest Canada Relations Committee was created in 1991 to ensure that the perspective of state and provincial legislators is presented to federal officials in Washington, D.C. and in Ottawa. Legislators from 11 Midwestern states and 4 Canadian provinces serve on the committee. Another mission of this committee is to provide a cross-border forum for dialogue and information sharing. And today's webinar is designed clearly for that. And to that end, it also organizes legislative exchanges between state and provincial legislators. So today I welcome you to the Midwest Canada Relations Committee's webinar on missing and murdered Indigenous relatives. I want to give a special thanks to the members of the committee who are joining today, and also to CSG staff Mitch Arvidsson, Eileen Grossman, and Laura Tamaka for their coordination of today's virtual event. Some introductory background information on missing and murdered Indigenous relatives. In both Canada and the US, Indigenous people, especially women and girls, are disproportionately impacted by murders, violence, and disappearance. In the US, Native American women are more than twice as likely to experience violence than any other demographic group. And the lack of data on these crimes and the low rates of prosecutions for these crimes are also a major issue. During the committee's last meeting in July 2021, Minnesota Senator Kunesh introduced a resolution on missing and murdered Indigenous relatives. But at that time, many of you will remember, because of the COVID-19 border closures, most of our Canadian committee members were unable to attend the meeting or to be able to vote on any resolution. And it was therefore decided to defer discussion and any action on the resolution at that time to a later date, but to gather information on the subject before the next meeting of the committee. Today's webinar offers the opportunity to become more informed on the subject. It's my pleasure now to introduce the moderator of today's panel discussion, Minnesota Senator Mary Kunesh. Senator Kunesh is an educator. She retired from her role as a public school library media specialist after 25 years of service, but she has continued to answer the call of public service as a state legislator. Senator Kunesh was first elected to the Minnesota House of Representatives in 2016, re-elected in 2018, and then she was elected to the Minnesota Senate in 2020, representing the 41st district. She is the first woman of Native descent to be elected as a Minnesota state senator, and she serves as an assistant minority leader for the Democrat Farmer Labor Senate Caucus. And with that, it's my honor to welcome Senator Kunesh and our distinguished guest today. And at this time, I am pleased to turn the virtual podium over to Senator Kunesh to host the rest of today's program. Senator.
Well, thank you so much for that introduction, Speaker Cupp, and thank you to everyone who is joining us here today. Today's webinar will include an explanation of how crimes of murder, violence, and disappearances disproportionately impact our Indigenous people, especially our women and girls. We will also discuss possible solutions on how to respond to the systemic causes of violence, collect and report data, address institutional policies and practices, how we can reduce and eliminate violence, and hold Indigenous victims and survivors in our hearts, families, and communities to prevent and heal from any of the violence that we have. We're going to start a presentation here with two co-authors of the Minnesota Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women's Task Force, and then we'll hear from a representative of the Manitobaan provincial government and leader of the Manitoba-based Indigenous Community Organization. And then finally, we will have about 10 minutes at the end of the presentation for questions and answers. So next slide. These are our two presenters, Nicole Martin-Rogers and Nicole Matthews. Ms. Martin-Rogers is a White Earth Ojibwe descendant. She has been with Wilder Research since 2001, where she designs and consults on program evaluations and community-based applied research projects. She's very focused on culturally responsive and Indigenous evaluations and facilitates data-informed decision-making processes. Nicole has a bachelor's degree in psychology and sociology from the University of Minnesota, a master's degree in public policy from the Humphrey School at the University of Minnesota, and a doctorate in sociology from the University of Minnesota. Nicole volunteers at the Roosevelt School Indian Education Parent Committee and previously served as board chair for both the St. Paul Children's Collaborative and Tiwahe Foundation. Ms. Matthews, Nicole Matthews, is a descendant of the White Earth Band of Ojibwe and is the executive director for Minnesota Indian Women's Sexual Assault Coalition, a statewide tribal coalition and national tribal technical assistant provider. She addresses sexual violence and sex trafficking against Indigenous people. Nicole served as the vice chair of our Minnesota Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women's Task Force. She serves on the executive council of the Young Women's Initiative of Minnesota. She has served on the state of Minnesota Attorney General's working group on sexual assault, and she is a TEDx speaker. She's also international and nationally known speaker on sexual violence and sex trafficking and the intersection of racism and oppression. And so I know that absolutely without these two women, we wouldn't be able to do the work. So we will continue on to the next slide, please. I just thought I would give you a little bit of a rundown of what the Midwest looks like as far as our Indigenous folks. I'm sorry I don't have the Canadian provinces because I'm not quite sure how you identify all the different tribes. But these are the 11 Midwestern US states and Canadian, without the Canadian provinces. And the numbers next to the states identify the number of federally recognized American Indian tribes in those states. And it's really important to know that because while we have these recognized tribes in each state, there are still plenty of other Indigenous people, Native American folks that live within our states. And many of our families have tribal connections between states, Wisconsin, Minnesota, and the Dakotas. And so it's really important to recognize that the issues that we have here in Minnesota around our missing and murdered relatives is not unique to Minnesota, not unique to the Midwest, but definitely a national, if not a global pandemic. Next slide, please. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the background and context for our task force, what we actually did. We'll share some of our key findings, the mandates that came out of that report and next steps. And then I have some suggestions for what you can do. And yes, hopefully you will have some questions at the end. So I think it's important to recognize where this all started. I was elected into the Minnesota House of Representatives in 2016 and had my first session in 2017. And it was that summer that, first of all, I listened to the Canadian report out of the BBC on their national study on missing and murdered Indigenous women. And it was heartbreaking. It wasn't anything new, you know, but the fact that somebody had finally decided to take a really investigative approach to it and identify all these different relatives and ancestors that have been murdered or are lost to us forever. And it really stuck to me. And then it was the same summer that Savannah LaFontaine Gray went from Spirit Lake Nation went missing. And I don't know if you all know about her story, but she was 8 months pregnant, very excited to be bringing her first child into the world, was invited to a neighbor's home in the apartment building and was never seen again. And her disappearance did not make local news, national news, the way many have in the past, but we knew about it within our social media platforms in Indian country. You know, messages were posted, signs like this were posted, and there wasn't a lot of attention until they found her body a few days later. There were kayakers in the river there that found her body floating in the river, and the baby had been cut from her womb. And then it got very sensationalized, and the search went on to find her child, and it actually were the neighbors that she went to visit who had plotted how they were going to steal that baby from her. And so with those two incidents back to back, and North Dakota doing some quick work at the federal level around Savannah's Act, I thought, why, you know, if Canada's doing this work, why isn't the United States doing this work? If North Dakota is doing this, why isn't Minnesota? And with that, I marched back into our capital and got researchers together to put together a bit of a preliminary bill. And then I invited the women, the people from our community across the state, our Native women, to help me craft this legislation. And so it really is the voices and the guidance of those women, dozens of women in Minnesota that helped put together this legislation that has really been impactful. So next slide, please. And just a few little pieces about Minnesota. Although American Indian women and girls make up just 1% of our population here in Minnesota, between the years of 2010 and 18, 8% of all murdered women and girls in Minnesota were American Indian. Anywhere in the months between 2012 and 2020, somewhere between 27 and 54 American Indian women and girls in Minnesota were missing. And these are data points that the general public or most people have no idea about. We certainly didn't know it before this task force, even though Nicole Matthews worked very hard on a sex trafficking report and continues to do that work. But those are the data points I could not find prior to our research in this task force. And so those are the things that we have been dealing with, is trying to gather those data points and address the issues. The next one. And I just thought I would share with you a little bit about our nations here in Minnesota. We have 11 federally recognized tribes, Anishinaabe or Ojibwe. And many of our relatives we share with our Canadian neighbors to the north. And then we have our Dakota tribes as well. One thing about Minnesota that is unique is that we are a Public Law 280 state, which is a federal law, or a federal law that really confuses and complicates jurisdictional issues. Red Lake and Boys Fort here in Minnesota decided not to participate in it, so they are self-governing. The rest, we have kind of a complicated system of federal, local, county police and jurisdictions, and that really complicates this issue. So let me see. I think I am going to pass it now over to Nicole Matthews to talk a little bit about the requirements of the task force. Nicole?
I believe it's Nicole Martin Rogers.
Is it Nicole Martin? Yes, it is. Martin
It's
Rogers.
hard.
Thank
It's
you.
hard to keep us straight when we're both Nicoles, but I'll take the next couple of slides. Thank you, Senator Kunesh. This is Nicole Martin Rogers speaking. I'm a research scientist at Wilder Research, and I did the research and wrote the report for the task force, and I'm happy to share a couple pieces of information right now. First of all, this is the language that was included in the legislation that created the task force. And so these were the things that the task force was required to do, including examining the systemic causes behind the violence that Indigenous women and girls experience, examine methods for tracking and collecting data. As Senator Kunesh mentioned, there are not good, there's not one database in the state or the country that tracks these things. So we had to go into all sorts of different state data systems to try to pull the data for the different relevant pieces of information. We are also asked to report on the policies and institutions, including policing, child welfare, coroner practices, and other governmental practices that impact violence against Indigenous women and girls, and also looked at the investigation and prosecution of crimes against Indigenous peoples. And if you go to the next slide, we also produced some information about what measures would be necessary to address and reduce violence against Indigenous women and girls. We'll show you the mandates that we produced through the task force in a minute. And also examine measures to help victims and their families and survivors prevent and heal from this violence that our communities have experienced for generations. And it's important to note that we had a really robust task force that was specified by the legislation who would be included on the task force, including state representatives and senators and representatives from each of the 11 tribes. We had state agency representatives from the relevant state agencies, as well as law enforcement representatives at the local level, county attorneys, US attorneys. We also had a number of nonprofits represented that serve this population. And then we also had a number of folks who were individuals who are directly affected by the issue that were on the task force. And so I'd like to thank and acknowledge all the work and expertise from these individuals that went into producing this final report. So in terms of what the task force did, we started with in-person meetings, and then because of the pandemic, we had to move to virtual task force meetings. And so we had several full-day meetings where we included expert presenters, like the person who runs the missing persons clearinghouse at the Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension, and Judge Marion Buehler, who ran the Canadian task force, and other experts like that to come and talk to us about various aspects of the issue. We also had folks who are, again, survivors, victims, relatives, who came and provided public comments. And we also had separate public comment sessions as well to let people share their individual stories of their experiences, which was really eye-opening about some of the things where investigations really failed individuals and families and communities, and where it was obvious to everyone involved that things did not go the way that they could have gone or should have gone to help resolve a terrible situation. There was already a terrible situation, and then it just got worse through the investigation and things like that. So we heard a lot of things from people that were directly affected. We also completed a literature review and interviewed a number of experts around Turtle Island, which is how Ojibways call North America. All sorts of experts who know about the issue. And then we also, next slide, please, looked at data, again, from a number of different sources. So we had to go into different state agencies. These are all state agency data sources to look at different aspects of the issue related to child welfare data, related to deaths, human trafficking, missing persons, unidentified deaths. There's all these are different data systems that we had to look at. And then importantly, we really deliberated carefully with the task force, using all this information that we had compiled to really hone in and pinpoint on the mandates, which is what we call the recommendations, because they're stronger than recommendations. These are obligations, things that we have to do for our community. And so we'll show you what those are in a minute. And I'm going to turn things over to Nicole Matthews now to talk about some of the key findings from the study.
Thank you. So, we certainly knew a lot of this going into this, but really looking at, some of the key findings and root causes of being a direct impact of colonization and historical trauma, and how that plays out in our communities. And along with that goes, the racism that our people experience in many of our states and communities. And then also looking at sexism and sexual objectification of our Indigenous women. And you look at the imagery of that is, that we can find all over about who Native women are. And oftentimes it's very sexualized and objectified. And, many years ago when we did our research on Native women who were used in prostitution and trafficking, we heard multiple stories about the ways that Native women were objectified, about, sex buyers wanting them to role play that they were Pocahontas and he was John Smith, and many stories of similar stories around sexism and sexual objectification. And then, of course, we have, multiple sports mascots that really are harmful to our communities. And, it's great to see we've had multiple sports teams now who are changing their mascots after many years of people calling on them to do so, are finally making that shift, which has been great. Next slide, please. So some of the systemic risk factors we looked at, it's not about bad lifestyle choices, right? Because oftentimes when Indigenous women go missing, the narrative and the media is always about like, what did she do? Or what we've seen instead of, the pictures of a woman who makes you feel, sorry or want to help, and makes you feel, something for this person. We have seen women's mugshots shown and in ways of blaming the victim for their what they probably did wrong, right? And so we know that it's not about bad lifestyle choices, but there's systemic risk factors that increase the risk of violence and abuse for our Indigenous relatives. That includes poverty and a lack of housing, which is a direct correlation to the impact of colonization. And again, going back to those women that we interviewed for our trafficking research, 98% of the women that were used in trafficking were currently or previously homeless. And many of them knew someone who they had never seen nor heard from again. So we know that poverty and housing is a huge issue and a huge risk factor in going missing and being murdered. Involvement in the child welfare system and the criminal justice system. Again, our communities are overrepresented in the criminal justice system, and our children are taken away at record numbers. You know, Minnesota has some of the highest rates of out-of-home placement of our Indigenous children in our country. And I think that's something we really need to address and to look more into. And then, you know, looking at victimization issues with domestic violence, and again, with prostitution and trafficking, these are all risk factors that puts a person, puts women at, you know, a higher risk for being missing, for being murdered. We heard stories of women who had been murdered by their partners, and some stories where, you know, it was classified as a suicide, but the family knew and the community knew that it was in fact a domestic violence homicide. Next. So looking at justice, right? Like there's many different ways to look at justice, but once, you know, once an Indigenous woman goes missing, you know, we have the investigation, the prosecution, and the sentencing that are all supposed to serve justice, but oftentimes do not. And so it is challenging, right? It is challenging when we look at what are those systems that are supposed to provide justice. You know, we looked at investigation, who's doing the investigations, how quickly are they to respond? If they're not responding, why aren't they responding? What are the circumstances that tie that up or that make there a delay? When we look at prosecution, how is that being handled? Are they prosecuting these cases? And if not, what are the issues? Again, looking at some of those jurisdictional issues, right? We know that, you know, in Minnesota, because we have public law 280 and non-public law 280, that means we also have multiple jurisdictions who are responding to this, right? And so in public law 280 tribes, we have the state who has concurrent jurisdiction over our major crimes, including murder, sexual violence. And then in our non-PL 280 tribes, we have the federal government who has concurrent jurisdiction with the tribes. And then to complicate it, we don't have jurisdiction over non-Indian offenders. So a lot of complicated issues when we're looking at how do we seek justice for our relatives. And then prevention and healing, which I think is so huge, right? Because most of us do this work and care about this work because we really want it to end. We don't want to keep having to have a, you know, another report or another data set to know what the issues are. We want to have prevention. We want this to end. In order for that to happen, we need to have culturally responsive healing resources and strategies to really make an impact for our communities. Trying to see, I think that's still me, right? Yes, sorry. So when we were creating our mandates, you know, we purposefully chose the term mandate because we wanted to make sure it was more than just a recommendation. This is not just something that we think the state should do, but this is something that the state must do. And there is a federal trust responsibility to respond to our Indigenous people on this land. And at the top of that was to create a missing and murdered Indigenous relatives office to have ongoing attention and provide leadership for this issue. And we almost were unsuccessful in having that But at the last minute, towards the end, we were able to get that through, and we now have permanent funding that will not sunset, will not go away, to implement a missing and murdered Indigenous relatives office in our state government. We just finished interviewing for the director position, and then there will be 3 more staff people in that office. So that is a huge win to continue coordinating many of these mandates and things that were put forth in this report. And along with that, again, funding, addressing those risk factors, including racism and poverty. That MMIR office will do an annual report and dashboard that really addresses this issue and what is being done. Next. You know, it's incredibly important that we support our tribes in exercising their sovereignty and jurisdictional authority. It is not okay that our tribes don't have jurisdiction over non-Indian offenders who commit crimes on our lands. We should be able to prosecute and to address those crimes and to hold perpetrators accountable. And then looking at, you know, key legislation, including our Violence Against Women Act and our Safe Harbor laws, which provides protections for victims that are 24 and under, but also looking at how do we expand those to all victims of trafficking. And I know I'm going to skip through some of these because I know we have limited time today. And then I think this is my last slide. You know, I think when we want to look at prevention, I think it's important that we have conversations with our youth, with our young people on healthy relationships and consent, because unless we can name what the positive side is, what we're moving towards, we will never end it unless we can look at what that looks like. And then to continue increasing awareness and addressing the harms of all those intersections of sexual exploitation and violence and trafficking. And I would add, we have to keep pushing on our media and our systems to really respond appropriately to this issue and to make sure that we get the same response and the same attention as, you know, as our white counterparts and our white relatives who go missing and whose names we all know. And that's amazing. And we all deserve that. And I think I'm turning it back to Senator Kunish. Thank you.
There we go. Thank you, Nicole and Nicole. Honestly, this task force would not have been so successful and so thorough without both of these women as key elements of the process. And Minnesota and our tribes are certainly beholden to them and their depth of knowledge and empathy and their ability to pull the information out of the sources that we needed to. So we finished the task force and presented that report to our state legislature a year ago. And from there, we will continue to work on elements of the task force. As Nicole mentioned, we did pass legislation last year to secure that permanent funding for our Missing and Murdered Indigenous Relatives Office within our state government. It's the very first in the nation. And I would suggest that you all go for that, because we have to continue the work. I think it was the leader from Canada that said, do this report. This is wonderful, but don't put the report on the shelf to gather dust. Have action to it and continue that work. And so that is what we are absolutely committed to doing. So we are shortly going to be hiring our executive director and 3 staff members to continue this work. We will continue to develop implementation plans as we are able to gather and open doors of data throughout the state, continue the conversations as well. We really want to look within our Minnesota Department of Health at psychological autopsies and how that is affecting the work that we need to do and the past history, shall we say. And then just as we're doing right here today, continuing to raise awareness of the injustice. We've spoken, the three of us have spoken many times now across the nation to this issue and have found really positive response and feedback that has been very meaningful to other states. And then one of the really interesting things that also came out of this task force last session in Minnesota, I worked with Representative Ruth Richardson in the House, and we created the Missing and Murdered African American Task Force because all of us here, Nicole and me, here in Minnesota, totally, thoroughly recognize the intersectionality of the violence that our Native women experience historically very much mirrors that of our African American women. And it's not our intention to just focus on violence against Native American folks, but everybody in Minnesota. And so with the success of the MMIW task force, the legislature also put their efforts and their money towards the MMAAW task force as well. And we are on our way to, we've established that, we've met a few times, and we'll continue the work on that effort too. So what can you do as a legislator, as an elected official, as a community member, as an influencer? You can learn more about tribal, state, and local programs and services that support not only the survivors of sexual assault, rape, and violence, but also the ancestors of those that have gone missing, and listen to those that are talking to you today. Amplify your tribal, your Indigenous people's voices and information around the MMIW cause, if you can, on social media or within your platform. Talk to your friends, your families, your coworkers, and community members about the crisis. You will be amazed by what you learn just from meeting with and speaking with community members and building that kind of a trusting relationship. It's both heartbreaking, but it's also empowering, because those are the true stories. Those are the suffering, the historic suffering that our Indigenous folks have dealt with for generation after generation. And then, of course, recognize the land that we all reside on, Turtle Island, as our Ojibwe folks say, and what those tribal nations originally brought to this land and what they bring to our communities today. As a political approach, if you look at and even find the website for Operation Lady Justice, it's still there. President Trump established that task force in 2019 to address the MMIW crisis. President Biden has expanded that and has tasked our Secretary of the Interior, Deb Haaland, with creating a national task force to study this issue. So I would encourage you to go to that website and look at all the work that the different states are doing. Please study more about the Missing and Murdered Indian Crisis Act. It's a bill that's directing the head of the Government Accountability Office to now start reporting on law enforcement agencies and reporting how we're going to do that, because that was one of the biggest problems. It was collecting data and collecting data with fidelity that we could share, because everybody's collecting data or not collecting data, but they're doing it in different ways. And then be aware of the National Day of Awareness for MMIW, Native Women and Girls. That's usually May 5th, but across the nation, February 14th has also become like the Red Shawl Day, where we often will find marches or events to recognize those that are loved ones that we have lost. There's also a Savannah's Act. I mentioned that early, named in honor of Savannah LaFontaine Greywind. This bill directs the Department of Justice to review, revise, and develop law enforcement and justice proposals to address these issues. It was approved by the president. The Not Invisible Act. This was led by 4 of our Native American members of Congress, and this establishes an advisory committee or violent crime comprised of law enforcement, tribal leaders, federal partners, and survivors to make recommendations to DOJ and DOI. And I have to say, in this instance, or at this moment, please, please, please do your best to start developing trusting relationships with your tribal nations. Our federally recognized tribes are sovereign nations unto themselves. And with that comes a huge responsibility, but it is also, as elected officials and policymakers, our responsibility to reach out to them. Just remember that historically, we have not included those folks in our judiciary or policy or funding mechanisms. And our Native folks often feel like they are not part of that conversation, have not been welcomed into it. And so they might not be putting themselves out there or demanding to be a part of it. Please do your best to reach out to them, not just once, not just twice, not to say I did some consultation with our tribes, but do it again and again and again to build that trust and that collaboration. And then there is the Justice for Native Survivors of Sexual Violence Act. That's an amendment, and it is now held at the Committee on Indian Affairs. So as elected officials or folks that can influence federal legislation, all of these are issues that you can champion and really make a difference for your states and your communities. And then just the last one, hopefully, we are going to get the Violence Against Women Act reauthorized, because, you know, the fact of the matter is the fact that we have to go back every 3 years and get this reauthorized is really heartbreaking. Why shouldn't it be a permanent action? And what it does, it extends a lot more and provides a lot more resources, especially in Indian country, to address domestic violence, sexual assault, the dating violence and stalking that happens so often with our Native women. One of the statistics that hasn't been mentioned is that Native women report that it is non-Native men. And I think the latest statistic that I saw was 97% of the time, it is non-Native men who are the perpetrators. And so we need this reauthorization, and I would love to have it permanently made. So please contact your Congress folks and support this. And then just enforce ICWA, the Indian Child Welfare Act. This is special protection for our Native kids. And just as Nicole Matthews mentioned, in Minnesota, our Native kids are removed from their homes, put into foster care, and often into the adoption pipeline at higher number than any other population in Minnesota, oftentimes removed for reasons that other groups or other races are not. And so a lot of ignorance is out there around ICWA, Indian Child Welfare Act. And so I would encourage you to become better informed around that, and please advocate for stronger enforcement of that as well, so that we can keep our families together rather than dividing them and separating them generation after generation after generation. So that that concludes our presentation to you. We say Chimigwich, Wokalatanka, thank you. And we are happy to, our emails are all right there. Feel free to contact us with any questions or thoughts or ideas. And we are happy to take any questions you might have at this time. Oh, next we have our Canadian counterparts. Thank you so much. Rebecca Cook and Diane Redsky are going to share with us a little bit about what is going on in Canada. And let me see here.
Senator, for time's sake, we can skip my introduction and I could just go right into the PowerPoint if that's okay. I think folks can maybe read it later or something. I see we're at a very good time crunch here, but
sorry about that.
That is all good. You had many items you wanted to bring, very important items to bring forward. So
Yes,
Mitch, if that's okay, I'm just going to get started right into it. So good morning, everyone. Warm acknowledgement to you all. As I said, we're kind of on the time crunch, and I really encourage you all to, if you can, to stay on a little bit longer today. So I'm pleased to present on behalf of the Manitoba government's work related to missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and 2S LGBTQIA+ peoples. So in Canada, we recognize that two-spirited and gender diverse are just at highest risk, and the numbers are just as high for missing and murdered. So in Canada, just a bit of context, Indigenous women and girls and 2S+ individuals continue to be disproportionately affected by gender-based violence. Although Indigenous women make up 4% of Canada's female population, 16% of all women murdered in Canada between 1980 and 2012 were Indigenous. Indigenous women and girls now make up 24% of female homicide victims. So Indigenous women in Canada are also 3 times more likely than non-Indigenous women to be victims of violence. Our Canadian federal government estimates over 4,000 missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls and 2S+. So currently this data oversimplifies and underrepresents the scale of the issue, yet it still demonstrates a complex and pervasive pattern of violence against Indigenous women and girls who are often targeted because of their gender and Indigenous identity. So simply that space, Indigenous women, girls, etc., are put in those violent spaces. We don't have safe spaces. Numerous reports and studies on violence towards Indigenous women in Canada have identified the very similar and or same underlying causes as our Midwestern counterparts, poverty, homelessness, those historic factors in present day racism, sexism, etc., but also the devastation caused by the Canadian Indian residential school systems. So Manitoba has been identified as ground zero, not only in terms of raising awareness nationally on the issue, but also because of 19-year-old Helen Betty Osborne, who was a young Indigenous woman. She was abducted, assaulted, and murdered by 4 non-Indigenous men in 1971. In 1988, the Manitoba government created the Aboriginal Justice Inquiry, which concluded it was clear that Betty Osborne would not have been killed if she had not been Indigenous, and that those who abducted her showed a total lack of regard for her person or rights as an individual. So addressing violence and incidents of MMIWG2S+ remains a priority for Manitoba. We acknowledge and honor the women, the girls, families, and communities who have lost loved ones to this international tragedy. And for those who have been taken from us far too soon. We are committed to working together to keep women, girls, and 2S+ people safe and to supporting families who have been impacted by these tragedies. So just a background on the national inquiry. So back in December 2015, Canada, the federal government announced that its national inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls as a key government initiative to end the high levels of violence against Indigenous women and girls. The goal of this inquiry was to investigate and report on systemic causes of all forms of violence and examine the underlying social, economic, cultural, institutional, and historical causes that contribute to the ongoing violence and the vulnerabilities. In 2016, Manitoba joined with other provinces and territories in participating in the inquiry as a way to advance reconciliation and to support families of MMIWG. And just to reference back to what Senator had mentioned, in Manitoba, we've got 64 First Nations. We call them nations. We've got over 86,000 Métis. We've now got at the tip of Manitoba, the Inuit, who is in the process of land transfer. And we get over 20,000 Inuit into Winnipeg and other urban centers in Manitoba for health and education needs. Back in 2018, the government of Manitoba established a new gender-based violence committee of cabinet, whose mandate is to take a government-wide approach to coordinate policies, legislations, and initiatives aimed at addressing intimate partner and sexual violence. This committee is taking an active role in working to address MMIWG. As you might be aware, in 2019, the National Inquiry released its final report entitled Reclaiming Power and Place, the final report of the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls. And that report included 231 calls for justice for all governments, institutions, industries, and all Canadians. My department, the Manitoba Indigenous Reconciliation and Northern Relations Department, with support from the Manitoba Status of Women, received a mandate from our Gender-Based Violence Cabinet Committee to engage with key departments to conduct a detailed review and cross-departmental analysis of those calls for justice. We also received a mandate to engage with Indigenous organizations, leadership, families, and survivors on their priorities with respect to the inquiry's final report. The engagement process is largely complete, and a review of the efforts across government that respond to those calls to justice is also well underway. Manitoba is working to develop concrete and effective response to the national inquiry that builds into the work that is underway at a community level and aligns with the main pillars of our gender-based violence framework. The Manitoba government has also taken steps in an effort to address the issue of MMIWG. However, our analysis of provincial activities suggests the need for further alignment of government actions and with our Indigenous and community-based priorities, which our friend Diane will share with you shortly. Any consideration of the calls for justice must be accompanied by meaningful engagement. In particular, the voices of families and survivors is critical. The core principle of nothing about us without us reflects the view that policy should not be decided without full and direct participation of individuals and groups who are affected by that policy. Our broad engagement plan is essential to ensure an aligned and effective path forward and intended to capitalize on Manitoba's strong and dedicated, vibrant networks who are already working and continue to work to end violence against Indigenous women and girls. So again, that response cannot be standalone. It needs to be Indigenous-led with community, truly forming a whole of province response. In the meantime, Manitoba has undertaken more immediate activities that align with these calls for justice and to support efforts to end violence against Indigenous women, girls, and 2S+. Some of these accomplishments include being the first province in Canada to officially recognize October 4th as Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls Honoring and Awareness Day. We've provided 6.4 million to 24 community organizations to deliver programs that address the diverse needs of victims, including 850,000 for agencies that support survivors of sexual violence. Working with Indigenous leadership, police agencies, and other partners to fully incorporate the use of restorative justice options where appropriate. And through ongoing partnerships with Indigenous community members and elders was the introduction of eagle feathers for use in our Manitoba courtrooms. A smudging room is now also provided for victims and families, as well as cultural and ceremonial healing through the Compensation for Victims of Crime program. We also continue to work with the Clan Mothers, which is a collective of Indigenous women, elders, who created an Indigenous-led healing village to enhance the accessibility of land-based teachings for Indigenous youth who are at high risk of sexual exploitation. This includes a recent funding commitment of an additional $3 million to support the Clan Mothers. We've developed a Manitoba post-secondary sexual violence policy guide to assist post-secondary institutions in creating safe campuses through policies, engagement, training, and initiatives. We've invested over $5 million in supports for people experiencing homelessness as a part of the COVID-19 response, because we know the issue of MMIWG is multifaceted and multisectional, and that being homeless puts your safety at risk. Government is proud to support various community and family-led vigils, healing gatherings, and events. We know that the process of healing must be community-driven, and we know that we have a role to play in addressing this injustice. And most recently, government introduced amendments to the Manitoba Path to Reconciliation Act that would establish the calls for justice of the National Inquiry as a key component of its approach to advancing truth and reconciliation, and to continue to shine further light on the importance of addressing systemic causes of all forms of violence, including sexual violence against Indigenous women and girls and 2SLGBTQIA+ peoples. Public awareness and honoring missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls is another key initiative in Manitoba. As you can see from the slides, in partnership with community, we had a red dress gobo light display on our Manitoba Legislative Building on June the 3rd, the second anniversary of the inquiry's report. We've also got a mural in Winnipeg that shows the faces of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. And you can faintly see from this picture some of the names and their ages. Jennifer Catchaway, 18 years old, Sunshine Wood, 16 years old, Felicia Solomon Osborne, 16, Cerise Houle, 17. We've got also a prominent statue in Saugeen First Nation. Its meaning, life flows forever. And a stone monument, the first of its kind in Canada, to honor MMIWG in Winnipeg at the Forks in a celebration circle. So in closing, everyone has a right to safety, and everyone has that right to live free from violence, those safe spaces. It's unfortunate that at this time, the pandemic has had an impact on so many of us. So I want to acknowledge and honor those who have lost loved ones to this pandemic. With that, I wish you well and stay safe, Miigwech. Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank you very
Rebecca.
much. Thank you very much, Rebecca, and sorry to everyone. And thank you, Diane, and everyone for staying on a little past 11. But have a lot of important information left. So Diane, you can continue with your presentation now. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll do my best to summarize my speaking notes here. So I'd like to begin with thanking Rebecca for her presentation on the MMIW 2S+ National Inquiry and setting the context on the reality of violence against Indigenous women and girls in Manitoba and how the Manitoba government is responding to support the community to lead. I would first like to acknowledge the MMIW 2S+ families and survivors here today, and for the families that continue to seek justice. It is your voice and the voice of generations of families and survivors who never gave up to be heard, respected, treated equitably, and to be secure and safe. Your strong and powerful voice made the National Inquiry in Canada happen. Thank you, Miigwech, from all of us. My presentation today will focus on more of the process, the how-to, the mechanics of the National Inquiry to developing national action plans and how this was operationalized within Manitoba so that wherever the solutions are, from those grassroots kitchen tables to Indigenous-led organizations and communities to province-wide initiatives, that they all are supported and work towards a necessary transformational change to end this crisis of violence against Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit LGBTQIA people. There are four slides linked to more information. I have provided these slides to the organizers of this meeting and they'll be available to you upon request. My hope is that you leave here today inspired and compelled to action, that you see how co-development is about the bottom-up, top-down, meeting in the middle is a powerful way to get to work together, where there is positive, meaningful, and sustained change for the long term, and you can see the pathway to ending violence. Most importantly, that MMIW 2S+ families and survivors are critical to the process from beginning to end and in concrete, meaningful ways. Rebecca shared some disturbing statistics about the reality of violence against Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit LGBTQIA people in Canada. And I really want to emphasize how this cannot be underestimated. We are specially targeted for violence, and it is embedded in our daily lives through the systems that normalize this violence. All of our work and advocacy to rebuild these systems so that they stop working against us, rather work for us. There is a way to get there, and we hope by sharing today, you can also see and have confidence in the path forward, because I'll tell you, our lives literally depend on it. This first slide here that you see, so it's the same slide you've been seeing, is a high-level overview of the National Inquiry. And I'd like to draw your attention to three things about this. First, a vital part of this process was the engagement of MMIW 2S+ families and survivors. We really mean it. Nothing about us without us. Secondly, a quote directly from the National Inquiry, quote, experts and knowledge keepers spoke to specific colonial and patriarchal policies that displaced women from their traditional roles in communities and governance and diminished their status in society, leaving them vulnerable to violence, unquote. Number three, the 231 calls for justice are directed at governments, institutions, social service providers, industries, and all Canadians for transformative legal and social changes. This is a multi-sector issue needing a multi-sector response. The Mama Wichita Center testified twice at the National Inquiry. The first time was Survivor Voice, where she shared her childhood exploitation of sex trafficking experience and the impact our safe house and rural healing lodge rooted in culture, values, and strengths was instrumental in helping her rebuild her life since she was 15 years old. The second time was to present a community-based solution where the Mama Wichita Center is part of a larger group of sister organizations that work in collaboration with the Winnipeg Police to address the victimization of sexually exploited women. All too often before 2013, it was common to criminalize women with prostitution-related offenses and rarely the men who were buying them. The common table we built created a really important opportunity to educate that women should not be criminalized because they need money to pay the rent or to feed their kids. Let's focus on helping her instead, while addressing those who prey and take advantage of their desperation. What had also happened at this session at the National Inquiry, our Winnipeg Chief of Police apologized to Indigenous women and girls for failing to protect us and promised to do better in the future. The National Inquiry gave us and thousands of other survivors and experts the opportunity to highlight the sexualized violence and offer tangible, concrete, community-based solutions. The next slide, please. This next slide is about the Calls for Justice, a national action plan. This began in June 2020, although behind the scenes work was occurring before this time in provinces, territories, federal government, and Indigenous, First Nation, Inuit, and Métis governments, and in communities leading up to the National Action Plan process. This National Action Plan was co-chaired by federal and provincial representatives and was completed in June 2021. You will see in this graphic, there is leadership from, firstly, a National Families and Survivors Circle at its core. This is a critical part of the process because this is their rightful place to guide, direct, and inform the process at a national, regional, and local level. There are also levels of government, including Indigenous governments, First Nation, Inuit, and Métis. Three specialized groups were also part of building the national action plans to fill a gap from the national inquiry. And those three are, the first one is Two-Spirit LGBTQIA+ sub-working group to restore the Two-Spirit people's rightful place in our traditional governance systems. Second, the data sub-working group. We know there are significant flaws in the current way data and research is being collected on Indigenous people and used to inform the way systems are set up. This is a real problem and is contributing to and responsible for directly creating risk and vulnerability for Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit LGBTQIA. We see a critical opportunity for data sovereignty. Thirdly, the urban sub-working group, which I've had the opportunity to chair, and you'll hear more about in the next slide. There is a clear link on this slide that you can see that you can read each of the national action plans that identify unique solutions and implementation plans based on their role and responsibilities to MMIW 2S+ in their territory. There is not one solution or one way to achieve better outcomes. What matters is how people are supported to determine and lead their own solutions. Before I move on to the next slide, you should know all of these groups continue their work on implementation at all levels of government and have responded with infrastructure and funding, such as the Government of Canada established a permanent department, the MMIW 2S+ Secretariat, with funding to support the work. And most importantly, the National Families and Survivors Circle continues to be at the core of this work and a voice for families. Next slide, please. This slide is the Urban Sub-Working Group. The Urban Sub-Working Group National Action Plan, the urban path to reclaiming power and place, regardless of residency. I'd like to say three things about our Urban Sub-Working Group. First, there are a variety of reasons on why Indigenous people are in urban areas away from their traditional territories, settlements, and homelands. And it's not a surprise that urban Indigenous people in urban areas got organized themselves to create thousands of urban Indigenous organizations across Canada to serve our people. This has ensured that community-based solutions are rooted in Indigenous culture, language, and ways of being. Urbanization does not equal assimilation. We must strengthen the enjoyment of our inherent rights wherever we live, work, and raise our families. Secondly, a key part of our report is the how-to, co-development leading to co-management. This is just not one sector's role. It is collective action, collective responsibility, and collective accountability. Lastly, our implementation plan focuses on the three areas: urban reality, responsibilities and accountabilities, co-development, coordination, and collaboration. It is vitally important not to overlook the urban Indigenous population. It is large and getting larger, and there are very unique risks for urban Indigenous women and girls and Two-Spirit LGBTQIA people. Urban Indigenous service organizations have many strengths, including decades of knowledge and experience directly connected to successful community action, experience, and development, accountability and transparency to community and funders, effectiveness of services and value for money, and innovation, adaptability, and community responsiveness. It is also important to note that most urban service delivery organizations are led by women. In the case of Friendship Centers in Ontario, for example, 70% of staff are women and 70% of program participants are women and children. We are women and girls, and we answer to women and girls. Our unique challenge is constantly proving our value to systems. For example, we have to work twice as hard to secure the little bit of funding we get to meet our unique needs for urban Indigenous families, because these older non-Indigenous institutions continue to receive funding to serve our people, and this practice needs to change. Respect for and full inclusion of the dynamic, resilient, and strong urban Indigenous communities and voices would lead to human rights advancements, culturally appropriate programs and services, and significantly improve socioeconomic conditions. Ignoring urban is also ignoring women. Next slide, please. And this is my last slide. Now to my home province, Manitoba. In Manitoba, Indigenous people make up 18% of the total population, with Winnipeg having the largest Indigenous population of any Canadian city. This is the work of the MMIW Plus. This is the work of the MMIW 2S Plus in Manitoba. Rebecca did a great job describing Manitoba government response and contributions, and I'd like to build on this and describe ways where our leaders and where we lead in some areas and where we have a long way to go in others. First, we have a strong, vibrant history of leaders, elders, and matriarchs who have paved the way for all of us to do this heart medicine work rooted in relationships. Our elders have shared with us, if it's easy, then you're doing it wrong. This reminds us of the value and importance of the journey and not a race to the finish line. Don't get me wrong, there are significant systemic changes that require immediate attention, such as a bold transformative approach would include the shifting of power, decision-making, and additional consistent resources and supports for urban Indigenous-led organizations. This also means this is not just about creating programs. Creating programs is important, but we also must have real system change so that the systems can start working for us and not against us. The PowerPoint slide shows who is fully engaged in doing the work. You can see there is a lot happening in Manitoba. We are still at the stage of creating that common table, that bottom up, top down meeting in the middle. And I have to tell you how impressed we are that this is coming together with several examples now of our federal and provincial governments working together and harmonizing their support to community-based Indigenous-led initiatives. I can't tell you how important this is to Indigenous-led organizations in Manitoba and across our country. Our latest project, the Manitoba Implementation Partnership Plan, is for Indigenous knowledge keepers to lead a process to bring together all gender-based violence and all other MMIW plans, organize them all, consult where we need to, and ensure the voice of everyone that needs to be involved is involved, and consolidate this into a co-developed Manitoba MMIW 2S Plus partnership implementation plan to end violence against Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit LGBTQIA people in Manitoba. We are so excited about this next step because it is Indigenous women leading and facilitating these important solutions and ensuring nothing about us without us. Collective impact, coordination, collaboration, whatever you call it, we are stronger when we work together. In conclusion, thank you so much for the invitation to be here. We honor your work, Senator Kunish. We know from experience it can be an uphill battle, and it takes great bravery, courage, humility, patience, a lot of that, to be in your role. We believe, similar to Canada, that this is a non-partisan issue. And we have faith that your colleagues will stand strong, stand with you, and the MMIW task force. So please feel free at any time to contact us to help support and advance your MMIW 2S Plus work in the United States. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Ms. Cook and Ms. Red Sky, for those presentations and that invitation to continue the work that we're doing together. And so with that, I think if we have any time for questions from the audience, Mitch, do we have any questions we need to address right now?
I want to give people a minute or two to type them in. I don't want to cut anybody off. And if you have any questions after post fact, please send them to me and we'll make sure that they are answered by our presenters as appropriate. I do have a personal question, and this goes for Senator Kunish, Rebecca, Diane, anybody. This is the Midwest Canada Relations Committee. Obviously, this issue does not recognize national borders or state borders. And before these borders were established, these Indigenous communities traveled from Manitoba to Minnesota and vice versa without any interference. What are ways that we can today, in modern times, work across border and intergovernmental ways on this issue?
Well, I think this is a first step in establishing the communication and the collaboration, but also the ability to perhaps share data. And when folks are looking for a loved one that's gone missing, or you know, there's a cold case that might involve both of our countries or within the different states, that we are all open to really finding the answers, not so much placing the blame, but finding the answers for those family members, but then also working together intrastate or you know, across the border to Canada, putting into place some safety policies, as well as ways that we can prosecute those that are doing injustice to our relatives.
That's great. Thank you for that answer. And then just one clarifying question from the Minnesota presentation. What is a psychological autopsy? What does that involve?
Psychological autopsies don't include just like the physical autopsy. Oftentimes a deceased person is brought in and looking for clues. The coroner or the doctor that's performing the autopsy will come to conclusions without taking into consideration perhaps input from the family or from people that know them. So too often we have seen after an autopsy, it's decided or it's listed as a suicide, when families and friends and relatives know that it was not a suicide. This person was not a suicide victim. There were extenuating circumstances, either within the community or within the relationship that person might be in. And so the ability to add to the information around the autopsy in order to really address the death of that person.
Absolutely. And thank you for that explanation. Like I said, if any of our attendees have questions for our presenters, please send those to me via email and we'll make sure your questions get answered. But at this point, I'll invite Senator Kunish to close us out.
Well, I want to once again thank you, Mitch, and the MLC Midwest Canadian Relations Committee for hosting this really important event, and for all of you that's stayed with us through it, even though we went over. And special thanks to all of our presenters for the time and the effort that you put into researching, working on, and presenting this information to us today. All of you that are here today as a participant, we appreciate you taking the time out of your day to join us. And on behalf of the Midwest Canada Relations Committee, we hope that you enjoyed today's session, even though it is a relatively somber topic. And I hope that we can continue this important conversation during the committee's next in-person meeting on Sunday, July 10th in Wichita, Kansas. So thank you all very much. Wopalatanka. And that concludes our seminar. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.